Before there was a United States, before there was even a word for America, an entire world already existed. Cities rose beside rivers, roads crossed mountains, nations traded, governed, prayed, and fought wars on land Europeans would later claim as untouched. Millions of people lived and died here without ever knowing that another world, far across the ocean, had begun to search for them. When Europe finally arrived, it did not come as a single ship or a single moment. It came as a sequence of choices made by kings, sailors, priests, and merchants, each decision pushing the next until nothing could be undone. By the time the process ended, civilizations had collapsed, empires had fallen, populations had been reduced beyond recognition, not through one battle and not through one conquest, but through a chain reaction that unfolded over centuries. This story does not begin with Christopher Columbus. It begins long before him, with people who never asked to be found, and with a continent that was never waiting to be claimed. The colonization of America was not an accident. It was not inevitable. It was the result of human ambition meeting opportunity across an ocean that had, until then, kept worlds apart. Once that crossing happened, there was no turning back. Before America had a name. When Europeans arrived, America was not empty. It was already full of people, full of memories, full of history that stretched back thousands of years. Long before any European map placed a name on this land, generations of human beings had shaped it with intention. They cleared forests, redirected rivers, planted fields, built cities, and governed societies whose complexity rivaled anything across the Atlantic. This was the world before 1492. North America, Central America, and South America were not separate stories. They were part of a vast human network, connected by trade, migration, shared knowledge, and conflict. From the Arctic tundra to the tropical rainforests, people adapted to their environments with precision learned over centuries. Along the Mississippi River, a city known today as Cahokia rose from the floodplain. At its height, centuries before Columbus, Cahokia covered more land than London did at the same time. Massive earthen mounds dominated the landscape. One of them, now called Monk's Mound, rose higher than a 10-story building. Tens of thousands of people lived there, governed by leaders whose authority blended politics, religion, and ceremony. Farmers produced surplus crops of maize, squash, and beans, sustaining an urban population Europe would not expect to exist in this land for centuries. To the northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois, developed a sophisticated system of governance based on collective decision-making. Separate nations retained autonomy, yet bound themselves through law, diplomacy, and shared responsibility. This political structure endured for generations, regulating war, peace, and internal disputes through councils rather than kings. Far to the south, in the heart of Mesoamerica, the Maya civilization mapped the sky with astonishing accuracy. They tracked planetary movements, predicted eclipses, and developed calendars that measured time far beyond a human lifespan. Their cities, including Tikal, Copan, and Chichen Itza, rose from stone and limestone, aligned with astronomical events that governed ritual and agriculture. West of the Maya heartlands, the Aztec Empire ruled from its capital, Tenochtitlan, a city built on an island in Lake Texcoco. Causeways connected it to the mainland, aqueducts delivered fresh water, markets drew tens of thousands of traders daily, exchanging food, textiles, tools, and luxury goods. Spanish soldiers who would later enter the city admitted that they had never seen anything comparable in Europe. South America was dominated by the Inca Empire, the largest state in the Western Hemisphere before European arrival. From their capital at Cusco, Inca rulers governed millions of people across mountains, valleys, deserts, and coastline. They built roads that stretched more than 25,000 miles, carved into cliffs and spanning ravines with suspension bridges. Messages moved swiftly through runners trained to cross extreme terrain. Food was stored in state warehouses, redistributed during famine, and regulated by officials who understood their land in detail. These civilizations did not exist in isolation. Trade networks moved obsidian, copper, shells, feathers, textiles, and food across vast distances. Knowledge traveled with merchants and migrants. Agricultural practices were refined over generations. Corn bred from wild grass, potatoes cultivated in the Andes, irrigation systems engineered to control water with seasonal precision. This world functioned, it adapted, it endured, but it had never faced what was coming. While the Americas flourished, Europe struggled. By the late 1400s, much of Europe was trapped in cycles of famine and war. Harvests failed, populations pressed against limited land, kingdoms fought over borders that shifted constantly. The Catholic Church wielded immense influence, enforcing doctrine while competing with rising monarchies for power and loyalty. Trade routes to Asia, the source of spices, silk, and luxury goods, were controlled by powerful empires in the Middle East and Central Asia. European merchants paid high prices for access. Kings saw their treasuries drained. Wealth, status, and survival became intertwined. Europe wanted alternatives. It wanted new routes. It wanted resources. It wanted an advantage, and it believed the ocean held the answer. Shipbuilding improved, navigational tools grew more reliable, maps became more ambitious, filled with speculation where knowledge ended. Monarchs began funding voyages not to learn what lay beyond the horizon, but to reach it before their rivals did. This hunger did not come from curiosity alone. It came from pressure, from competition, from fear of falling behind. As Europe looked outward, it did not see a continent filled with nations. It saw distance. It saw opportunity. It saw land unaccounted for in its ledgers of power. The Americas, unknown to Europe, stood directly in the path of that ambition. And then, across the Atlantic, someone crossed the ocean. This is the complete story, from the first human footsteps on American soil to the moment European empires claimed a land they did not understand and reshaped history forever.
Europe's desperation and the age of exploration. Europe didn't sail west out of curiosity, it sailed west out of desperation. Not because people suddenly wanted adventure, not because they suddenly dreamed of distant lands, but because the world they knew was closing in on them. Europe stood at a crossroads, economically strained, politically fractured, and hungry for access to wealth that had been locked beyond deserts, mountains, and empires. What lay beyond the horizon was unknown to them, yet the force pushing them outward was unmistakably urgent. We return now to Europe in the late 15th century. This was a land dotted with powerful kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, Portugal, England, and France. Each vied for influence, wealth, and security. The Catholic Church dominated religious life. Kings fought wars to expand their borders. Merchants competed for profit, and the demand for luxury goods, spices, silks, and precious metals grew steadily among Europe's elites. But trade routes that had once brought riches across continents were slipping out of Europe's control. Routes across the Silk Road, once protected by vast empires, became unsafe and thoroughly dominated by powers that demanded tolls and taxes. Ottoman Turks controlled access to the Eastern Mediterranean, effectively blocking the traditional paths through which European merchants reached Asia's spices and silks. With overland routes increasingly uncertain, cash-strapped kings faced a stark reality. Europe needed new pathways to reach the wealth of the East. Trade had long shaped European ambition. For centuries, Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa had dominated commerce between Europe and the Middle East. They brokered east-west trade, moving goods through the Mediterranean and across land to northern markets. But this monopoly came at a price: high costs, limited access, and political leverage that enriched a few while impoverishing many. By the mid-1400s, Europe faced additional economic strains. The Great Bullion Famine, a shortage of gold and silver, tightened the flow of currency through European economies. Precious metals, the bloodline of commerce, were scarce, undermining trade and forcing European leaders to rethink how wealth could be obtained. The lure of lands rumored to contain gold and silver grew stronger every year. At the same time, technological advances were rapidly changing what was possible at sea. For most of human history, long-distance ocean travel was risky because ships were simply not built for it. Medieval ships hugged coastlines, wary of open waters and unpredictable weather. But in the 15th century, new designs changed the game. Shipbuilders in Portugal and Spain developed the caravel, a vessel light enough to navigate coastal shallows, yet sturdy enough for long ocean voyages. Caravels combined multiple sails that could catch the wind from different angles, enabling sailors to travel farther than ever before. Additionally, navigational tools like the magnetic compass, originally developed in China and later refined, and the astrolabe, perfected by Muslim seafarers, gave European navigators the ability to chart direction and latitude with unprecedented accuracy. These advances did more than make voyages possible. They made them plausible. Across Europe's kingdoms, courts and councils debated the promise of maritime travel. Some soldiers and advisors worried about the risks. Others saw opportunity where others saw danger. And throughout the 15th century, one Iberian kingdom in particular stood at the forefront of these experiments: Portugal. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portugal sponsored expeditions down the west coast of Africa, seeking a sea route that would bypass overland barriers and reach the fabled riches of Asia. Although Henry himself never crossed the equator, the voyages he sponsored charted islands and coasts previously unknown to Europeans, establishing fortified trade outposts and expanding Portugal's maritime expertise. Spain, to the west, watched closely. Unlike Portugal, whose exploration hugged the African coastline, Spanish thinkers pondered a more radical idea. What if Asia could be reached not by sailing south and around Africa, but by sailing west? The concept flew in the face of conventional wisdom. Europe's scholars had inherited Ptolemaic geography, a model of the world that placed vast distances between Europe and Asia, and made a westward crossing seem perilously long. Yet a few believed that the oceans themselves might bridge continents, if only one could survive the crossing. Economic motivations dovetailed with religious ones. The Catholic monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile had recently completed the Reconquista, ejecting Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula with the capture of Granada in January 1492. This moment unified their kingdoms and redirected their focus towards expansion beyond Europe's borders. In the same year, they issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling Jews from Spain, signaling a new era of consolidation and ambition, and one in which overseas ventures could serve both profit and piety. Across courts and taverns, maps were redrawn and debated. Ideas about the world's shape and size were tested against new astronomical knowledge. Those who believed the Earth was round argued that if west lay east, perhaps a westward route might provide access to the fabled riches of Asia, the spices, silks, and precious stones worth fortunes in European markets. But while many dismissed this notion as fantasy, one man believed the world was smaller than everyone thought. He was Cristoforo Colombo, better known today as Christopher Columbus, a sailor born in the bustling Mediterranean port of Genoa, accustomed to winds and waves from his earliest years. Columbus spent decades at sea, learning navigation, charts, and currents. He watched the Atlantic winds swirl around the Azores and the Canary Islands. He studied maps and maritime reports, and he became convinced that if one could sail far enough west, one might reach Asia, and with it the wealth that had long captivated Europe's imagination. Yet when he first presented his plan to the Portuguese court in Lisbon, his idea was rejected. Portugal's advisors, seasoned from exploration down Africa's coast, believed his estimates of distance were dangerously low. They saw no reason to gamble resources on a route untested and unproven, when advances in circumnavigating Africa were already yielding promising results. Still, Columbus persisted. He took his proposal to the court of Spain, a kingdom newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella, eager for new opportunities after years of costly war at home. For years he lobbied for support, refining his arguments, appealing to the monarch's growing desire for advantage over their rivals, and to the hope of spreading Christianity to lands never yet reached by Christendom. At last, in the spring of 1492, after years of negotiation, exhaustion, and doubt, the Spanish monarchs agreed to fund his voyage. 3 ships would be provided: the tiny Niña, the nimble Pinta, and the heavier Santa Maria. Fewer than 100 men would make the journey. Provisions were loaded: food, water, rope, tools, faith, and fear. Columbus agreed that any lands he discovered would belong to the Spanish crown, and in return, he was promised titles, rewards, and profit shares from any wealth brought home. For Columbus, this was not merely a voyage, it was a gamble with everything at stake. If he failed, he would lose reputation, honor, and possibly life itself. But if he succeeded, he would open a new chapter in human history, or so he believed. And then, on a warm August morning in 1492, the 3 small ships left the port of Palos de la Frontera, their sails catching the wind, their hulls cutting through waves that had never before been crossed in this direction. What Columbus found was not what he expected.
1492, the collision of 2 worlds. On October 12, 1492, history split in 2. Not with a single resounding clash, but with a moment of recognition, when strangers from across the ocean stepped onto sandy shores, setting in motion changes no one on either side could have fully imagined. The day did not look like an ending. It looked like a beginning. But the beginning would lead to loss, upheaval, and transformation at a scale still hard to grasp centuries later. After weeks at sea, following winds, stars, and his unshakable conviction, Christopher Columbus and his crew sighted land on a small island in the Bahamas. Columbus named it San Salvador. To the seafarers, this was the promised edge of Asia. To the people who already lived there, it was simply home, an archipelago of islands filled with human life, fishing canoes, cultivated fields, and intricate community networks that had existed for generations. The first encounter was not violent. On the morning of that October day, Indigenous peoples of the Taíno nation came out to meet the ships. They were curious and observant. They saw men in strange clothes stepping down gangplanks, bright cloth fluttering in the breeze. Some reached out with gifts: cotton fibers, woven baskets, small carved figures, tokens of hospitality offered in a culture where welcoming strangers was a recognized custom. Columbus later wrote that the Taíno were so much our friends that it was a marvel. To the Taíno, unfamiliar blue sails and iron tools were intriguing, but not necessarily threatening. Their world, rich with trade, agriculture, and spiritual life, had never encountered strangers like these. They spoke different languages, moved differently, and wore garments unfamiliar to those who had lived under Caribbean suns for centuries. Yet they extended a hand. For the Spaniards, this openness seemed like acceptance. For the Taíno, it was an act of customary hospitality. But underneath that greeting lay a profound fault line between what the Taíno expected from strangers and what the Europeans believed they had found. To Columbus and his crew, the islands were signs of promise. Palm trees stood tall, the sea was clear, fish teemed in shallow reefs, birds circled overhead. There was food, there was water, the environment seemed rich and welcoming. No one on the ships knew that behind this inviting scene lay a world on the brink of devastation, not from war or conquest, but from something far smaller and invisible. Before Columbus left for Europe, he established a small settlement near present-day Hispaniola called La Navidad. He did so by leaving men behind when his flagship, the Santa Maria, ran aground on a reef. He believed he had found fertile land for Spanish settlement, perhaps even gold. The people of Hispaniola, predominantly Taíno, continued to interact with these settlers. But the unfamiliarity between them was already growing. Misunderstandings emerged not only in language and culture, but in the very expectations each group brought to the encounter.
Conquest, gold, and the Spanish Empire. A handful of men brought entire empires to their knees. Not because they outnumbered their foes, not because they possessed extraordinary armies, but because of a convergence of ambition, technology, disease, and political cunning, forces that would reshape continents and remake the balance of power in the world forever. We return now to the Americas, 2 decades after Columbus's first voyage. The islands of the Caribbean had become a foothold for the Spanish crown. Outposts were established, fortresses built, and supplies stockpiled. From these beginnings, Spanish expeditions moved into the heart of the mainland, Central and South America, where civilizations far older and more populous than anything in Europe awaited. Spain's men were a mix of soldiers, adventurers, and fortune seekers, often young and desperate. They were called conquistadors, and they carried with them not only swords and armor, but also a belief in the divine right of conquest, sanctioned by their monarchs and justified through the expansion of Christianity. Among them, 2 figures would become emblematic of this era: Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro. Their actions would demonstrate how determination, tactical intelligence, and sheer audacity could topple empires that had ruled for centuries. In 1519, Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast of modern-day Mexico with fewer than 600 men. What he found was a land ruled by the Aztec Empire, a complex civilization with a capital at Tenochtitlan, an island city of canals, markets, and temples, home to hundreds of thousands. The Aztec Emperor Montezuma II governed a network of tribute-paying city-states, wielding power that combined military authority with religious significance. Cortés's small force should have been crushed. Steel swords against obsidian blades, horses against foot soldiers, these alone might not have guaranteed success. But Cortés employed alliances with discontented native groups who resented Aztec domination. He manipulated internal rivalries, exploited fears of prophecy, and moved decisively to control the capital. When he finally entered Tenochtitlan, Cortés and his men marveled at the city's size, its marketplaces, and its wealth. Temples were adorned with gold. Buildings rose in orderly plazas. The sheer scale of the city's organization stunned the Europeans. But gold was not merely admired. It became the object of desire, the motivation for conquest. Cortés demanded tribute, looted temples, and ultimately captured Montezuma. The result was a massive cultural and political collapse, accelerated by disease, famine, and rebellion within the city. Within 2 years, the once mighty Aztec Empire was no more, leaving Spain in control of vast wealth and territory. Half a century later, Francisco Pizarro would repeat the formula in the highlands of South America. The Inca Empire, stretching along the Andes from modern Ecuador to Chile, was immense, a network of roads, fortresses, and terraced farms connecting millions of subjects. Its ruler, Atahualpa, held authority over a population whose scale dwarfed any European kingdom. Pizarro arrived with fewer than 200 men. The Incas had never faced firearms, horses, or steel armor. Once again, alliances with discontented groups who opposed Inca rule proved decisive. Pizarro captured Atahualpa in a bold and calculated move, demanding enormous ransom in gold and silver. Even after the ransom was delivered, Pizarro executed the emperor, cementing Spanish control. The conquest of the Incas demonstrated a stark principle. Technology, disease, and political manipulation could outweigh numerical superiority. Within decades, vast empires that had persisted for centuries were reduced to colonial territories, their treasures flowing across the Atlantic to Spain. Across both empires, a pattern emerges. Steel swords and guns could defeat obsidian blades. Horses created psychological shock unmatched in battle. Disease decimated populations before armies even fought. Political alliances and betrayals weakened empires from within. Europeans exploited rivalries and promises, offering protection or freedom to those who sided with them, and crushing those who resisted. They understood that conquest was not merely about force, but about control over human networks, economies, and belief systems. In every case, the story was the same. A few hundred men, armed with a combination of ambition, steel, and cunning, could reshape the world when aligned with local discontent and disease that spread invisibly through populations. But conquest alone wasn't enough. The Spanish crown wanted wealth, it wanted status, it wanted an empire. The lands were only valuable if they could be exploited. Mines dug, crops harvested, native labor harnessed, and gold and silver extracted. Conquest and occupation became inseparable from extraction, giving rise to the encomienda system, forced labor, and the extraction of resources on a scale unprecedented in the Americas. Gold, silver, and other valuables were shipped back across the Atlantic in staggering quantities. Mines in Mexico and Peru supplied bullion that fueled Spain's economy, financing armies, ships, and further exploration. The sudden influx of wealth transformed Spain into Europe's first global superpower, dominating trade and politics in the 16th century. Meanwhile, the consequences for the Americas were devastating. Indigenous populations were enslaved, relocated, or wiped out by disease. Cities were razed, sacred sites plundered, and knowledge lost. The riches that built Spain's empire came at a human cost of imaginable scale. Other European powers were watching. Portugal had already carved its empire along Africa and Brazil. England, France, and the Netherlands were quietly funding explorers, learning from Spanish triumphs and failures. A new competition was about to begin, one that would spread across oceans and reshape the globe. The race for the Americas was no longer just about Columbus, Cortés, or Pizarro. It was about every kingdom in Europe, vying to stake a claim before the continent was claimed entirely.
The scramble for the New World. Spain wasn't alone for long. The riches of the Caribbean and the mainland had not gone unnoticed. Other European powers, England, France, and the Netherlands, had their eyes fixed across the Atlantic, eager to carve out a share of this new world. What began as isolated Spanish settlements would soon become the opening act of a massive geopolitical contest. By the mid-16th century, the New World had become a chessboard of ambition and fear. Spain had amassed gold and silver, but England sought opportunity. France desired fur and trade,
and the Netherlands was ready to challenge established powers with maritime skill and mercantile cunning. North America, unlike the more densely populated and centralized Aztec and Inca empires, was a mosaic of independent tribes and nations. Its forests, rivers, and coasts presented both opportunity and danger. Unlike the Caribbean, which Spain had claimed with relative ease, northern lands were more sparsely populated and fiercely defended by indigenous peoples. Every attempted settlement would test the limits of human endurance, skill, and diplomacy. The first wave of colonization in North America was fraught with failure. French explorers like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain navigated the St. Lawrence River in search of trade routes and fur-rich territories. Cartier's expeditions in the 1530s revealed a land rich in resources but resistant to European domination. Harsh winters, unfamiliar landscapes, and indigenous resistance made permanent settlement difficult. English attempts were even more dramatic. In the 1580s, Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored the Roanoke colony on the coast of present-day North Carolina. Colonists arrived with supplies, hopes, and skill, but faced hunger, disease, and isolation. Letters sent back to England described harsh winters and failed crops. The colony's ultimate fate remains one of history's enduring mysteries. When supply ships returned in 1590, the settlement had vanished. The word Croatoan carved into a post was the only clue left behind. Across the continent, other settlements failed for similar reasons. The climate was harsh, supply lines were long, European agricultural methods clashed with local ecology, and indigenous resistance was often underestimated. Tribes such as the Powhatan Confederacy, Wampanoag, and Iroquois challenged European incursions, defending their lands while engaging in diplomacy when it suited them. One English colony almost disappeared completely.
Roanoke had been envisioned as the gateway to England's American empire, yet it became a symbol of the perils of exploration. Starvation, disease, and isolation were constant threats. Conflicts with indigenous neighbors arose from misunderstandings and European arrogance. Letters and reports from survivors described desperation. Some had attempted to return home by canoe. Others had vanished into surrounding forests. The disappearance of Roanoke haunted England for decades. It underscored a simple truth: even with courage and technology, survival in the New World was far from guaranteed. Yet these failures did not deter European powers. They revealed lessons in survival, settlement planning, and the delicate balance between diplomacy and force with indigenous peoples. Supply chains were strengthened, fortifications improved, and alliances with local tribes carefully negotiated. European nations realized that North America was a world of uncertainty, one that required patience, persistence, and adaptation. Even as England mourned Roanoke and France struggled with harsh winters along the St. Lawrence, maps were redrawn, voyages planned, and new expeditions funded. The fear of failure created sharper, more calculated colonists. The stakes had never been higher because the prize, control of territory, resources, and influence, was immense. But the next attempt would change everything. It would introduce settlements that survived, grew, and became permanent footholds, colonies that would become the foundation of future nations. Lessons learned from hunger, disease, and indigenous resistance would transform European approaches. The scramble for the New World had begun in earnest, and the continents would never be the same.
Jamestown and the birth of English America. Jamestown was never meant to survive. It was planted on a marshy riverbank in Virginia,
a place riddled with mosquitoes, brackish water, and unfamiliar terrain. The English settlers arrived in 1607, believing they could transplant European life across the Atlantic, only to find that survival required more than courage. It demanded adaptability, diplomacy, and a willingness to endure hardship that few possessed. Yet, Jamestown would endure. But the path to permanence was paved with starvation, disease, and conflict, a reality far removed from the expectations of the Virginia Company or the English Crown. Virginia, 1607. A small fleet of 3 ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, carrying about 104 settlers seeking gold, trade opportunities, and new territory for England. They were organized under the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company motivated more by profit than survival. The Englishmen were largely unprepared for the environmental challenges they faced. The land was swampy, the river water brackish and disease-ridden, and the climate humid with long, harsh summers. The Chesapeake region was home to the Powhatan Confederacy, a sophisticated network of Algonquian-speaking nations led by Chief Powhatan, whose 30,000 subjects managed agricultural lands, trade, and complex political alliances. To the English, the Powhatan peoples initially seemed potential allies, or at least a resource to be leveraged, but cultural misunderstandings, arrogance, and competition for land would set the stage for conflict. The first years in Jamestown were catastrophic. Settlers struggled with food shortages, relying on poorly planned supplies and attempts at European-style farming unsuited to the land. Local crops like maize were unfamiliar, and many settlers refused to adopt indigenous agricultural techniques. Starvation became routine. The winter of 1609 through 1610, later called the Starving Time, saw as many as 80 to 90% of colonists perish from hunger and disease. Bodies were buried hastily. Cannibalism was recorded in desperate journals. Leadership conflicts exacerbated the crisis. Governors like Edward Maria Wingfield and later John Smith faced rebellion and mistrust among settlers, many of whom were gentlemen unaccustomed to manual labor. Smith's strict discipline and insistence on working alongside the colonists were initially unpopular, but became crucial for survival. The relationship with the Powhatan Confederacy was tense and complex. Initially, trade for food and local knowledge helped the settlers endure, but misunderstandings, theft, and cultural misinterpretations led to periodic hostilities. Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan, played a symbolic role in bridging contact, but her story belies the broader reality. The Powhatan nations were navigating the intrusion of a foreign power that disrupted their political and economic systems. Then, tobacco changed everything. John Rolfe, arriving in 1610, experimented with sweet, mild strains of tobacco suited to European tastes. By 1612, Jamestown's fields produced crops for export, creating a profitable cash crop that transformed the economic prospects of the Virginia Company and eventually the English Crown. Tobacco's success brought wealth, but also a new set of problems. Land hunger expanded, settlement encroached on Powhatan territory, and the demand for labor skyrocketed. The colony's growth was directly tied to agriculture that required intensive human labor that settlers initially could not supply on their own. Jamestown's newfound economic stability came at immense human cost. The Powhatan Confederacy was increasingly marginalized as settlements expanded. Violence escalated, culminating in skirmishes and wars that reshaped the region's power dynamics. Many indigenous communities were displaced or decimated by disease introduced by settlers.
Within the colony, settlers endured cycles of famine, disease, and harsh winters, surviving only through a combination of ingenuity, discipline, and ruthless pragmatism. Yet the plantation economy, fueled by tobacco, created a system that relied on hierarchical control, land expansion, and eventually the importation of forced labor. The wealth that flowed to England from Jamestown's tobacco fields was built on the suffering of both indigenous peoples and the settlers themselves. And labor became the next question. Jamestown had survived, tobacco had brought wealth, land was being claimed, but who would plant, tend, and harvest the fields? The colony's success hinged on a solution that would have far-reaching consequences. A solution that would shape the future of the American South and the lives of millions for centuries. The story of Jamestown was not just about survival, it was about the birth of English America, the establishment of the plantation economy, and the dark evolution of forced labor.
War, resistance, and the cost of colonization. Colonization always ends the same way, with resistance. No matter how well planned, no matter how disciplined the settlers, the arrival of Europeans disrupted centuries-old societies. Where forests, rivers, and fields once belonged to indigenous nations, new towns, forts, and plantations rose. And when survival and sovereignty collided, violence became inevitable. By the late 17th century, European colonies had expanded far beyond their original settlements. The English colonies in New England, Virginia, and Maryland pressed into territories long inhabited by indigenous peoples. The Wampanoag, Pequot, Narragansett, and Abenaki nations faced constant encroachment. Their lands were surveyed, parceled, and claimed under English law, often ignoring centuries of indigenous stewardship. Trading relations soured as European goods replaced traditional economies, and alcohol, firearms, and foreign diseases altered social dynamics. Tensions reached a breaking point when colonial authorities sought to impose stricter control over indigenous governance, culture, and movement. The result was uprisings, rebellions, and wars that revealed the enormous cost of European settlement. In 1675, a coalition of native groups led by Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, launched a coordinated resistance in southern New England. The war that followed became one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in North American history. Settlements were raided, farms were burned, colonists were killed or captured. The English responded with militias, scorched earth tactics, and alliances with rival tribes. Villages were destroyed, and prisoners enslaved or executed. The war spread across the frontier, touching Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and beyond. Colonists witnessed firsthand the fragility of their footholds, while native populations suffered catastrophic losses. Estimates suggest that up to 60 to 80% of the Wampanoag population perished from warfare, disease, and starvation. Entire communities were wiped from the map, their lands redistributed to settlers. Even after the fighting ended, the scars of conflict remained. Frontier violence reshaped settlements, created militarized towns, and entrenched colonial dependence on organized militias. Yet, despite the destruction, colonies were growing powerful. Trade networks flourished, towns expanded, and populations increased through immigration and natural growth. With power came confidence and restlessness. Colonists began to see themselves less as Englishmen abroad and more as Americans. New economic, political, and social structures created a distinct identity separate from the distant crown. Local governments, town meetings, and militias fostered self-reliance. Even as settlers secured land and resources, they carried memories of native resistance and frontier violence, shaping both their defense strategies and their attitudes toward indigenous peoples. These experiences forged a culture of resilience, self-determination, and suspicion of outside authority.
By the early 18th century, a new colonial identity was emerging. Colonists spoke differently, farmed differently, and governed themselves differently than their European counterparts. Their relationship with the land, shaped by centuries of native use and European imposition, was complex and deeply ingrained. Shared experiences of conflict, survival, and labor created bonds within communities, distinguishing them from recent immigrants and the distant monarchy. Colonists no longer simply saw themselves as Europeans in exile. They began to imagine themselves as members of a distinct, self-governing society, a society capable of defending itself, thriving independently, and perhaps one day making its own rules. And soon, they would turn against the empire itself. The lessons of resistance, survival, and frontier warfare had planted seeds of autonomy. Colonists had learned to govern, to fight, and to survive in ways their European rulers could neither dictate nor fully control. The stage was being set for revolution, for the moment when Americans would no longer tolerate distant oversight, and the vast, contested lands of the New World would demand a new political order.
Slavery, survival, and a new economy. America's wealth was built by people who never chose to be there. Fields of tobacco, rice, and sugar grew rich soil into gold for Europe. But the labor that turned seed into empire was provided not by free men, but by indentured servants, enslaved Africans, and forced laborers, whose lives and freedoms were taken to fuel a new economy across the Atlantic. The story of survival, exploitation, and power was entwined with every ship, every plantation, and every contract, a story that would shape the Americas for centuries to come. By the early 17th century, the Atlantic world was a dynamic, interconnected system of trade, migration, and conquest. European colonies in North America faced an ever-growing demand for labor. Tobacco plantations in Virginia required hands that the colony itself could not supply. Sugar in the Caribbean demanded toil that far outstripped the number of settlers willing or able to work. To meet this demand, European merchants turned to two primary solutions: indentured servitude and African slavery. Indentured servants, often young Europeans, agreed to work for a fixed number of years in exchange for passage to the New World. Many survived the harsh conditions, but countless others perished from disease, hunger, or abuse. Meanwhile, Africans were forcibly brought across the Atlantic in the transatlantic slave trade, beginning in earnest in the early 1600s. Captured from regions in West Africa, they endured the brutal Middle Passage, packed tightly into ships for months, enduring disease, starvation, and abuse before reaching the Americas. The human cost was staggering and permanent. Indentured servitude became a temporary solution for English colonies struggling to populate their lands. Young men and women signed contracts, usually 4 to 7 years, agreeing to work in exchange for passage, food, and shelter. While some found opportunity after completing their service, many faced harsh conditions, extended terms, or violence at the hands of plantation owners. Disease, malnutrition, and overwork were common. Some settlers tried to escape or resist, only to face brutal punishment. Diaries and legal records from Virginia and Maryland described a world where survival depended on endurance and compliance. The system was exploitative but initially legal, offering a veneer of choice to those trapped by circumstance. As the demand for labor increased, African slavery expanded. The first recorded Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, brought by English privateers who captured them from a Portuguese ship. At first, their status was ambiguous. Some were treated similarly to indentured servants. Over time, however, legal codes hardened their status into lifelong enslavement, creating a system that denied basic human rights and codified racial hierarchy.
Enslaved Africans brought knowledge, skills, and resilience. They cultivated crops, built infrastructure, and adapted European farming techniques to the Americas. Yet their lives were tightly controlled, families were separated, punishments severe, and freedom unattainable. Despite this, resistance emerged. Slaves ran away, rebelled, preserved cultural traditions, and found ways to survive mentally and spiritually under impossible conditions. The emergence of slavery transformed the colonial economy, entrenching a system where wealth, labor, and human rights were inseparably linked. It created social structures and divisions that would shape the colonies for centuries. But not all colonies followed the plantation model. In New England, settlers fled Europe for religious reasons rather than profit. Puritans, Pilgrims, and other dissenting groups sought freedom to practice faith without persecution. Their settlements, though often harsh and tightly controlled, relied more on family labor, community cooperation, and moral codes than on enslaved labor. This contrast set the stage for a divided colonial America, where economic motivations dominated the South and faith and community shaped the North. It also created the conditions for different interactions with indigenous peoples, varying patterns of settlement, and long-term regional identities that would endure into the 18th century. By the mid-1600s, colonial society was becoming rigidly stratified. Planters and merchants in the South accumulated vast wealth through plantations. Indentured servants struggled for survival and eventual freedom. Enslaved Africans were denied freedom entirely, forming the foundation of a racialized caste system. Indigenous peoples were increasingly displaced, confined to marginal lands, were subjected to violence and forced labor. These divisions hardened over generations, shaping laws, customs, and attitudes. Wealth, race, and status dictated opportunity, survival, and power. Colonial life was a mixture of opportunity and oppression, hope and despair, survival and exploitation. The economy, built on human and natural resources, set the stage for the emergence of a uniquely American system of labor and hierarchy. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, faith continued to drive migration. Puritans, separatists, and other religious groups sought to build settlements in New England where they could govern according to their beliefs. These migrations would introduce new cultural, social, and political dynamics, creating a contrast with the southern colonies and setting the stage for conflicts, cooperation, and a distinctive colonial identity.
Religion, refuge, and the Puritan dream. They crossed the ocean to escape persecution and built one of the strictest societies in history. Leaving familiar shores behind, groups of Puritans and Pilgrims risked everything for the promise of religious freedom. They would endure storms, hunger, and disease, determined to create communities governed by faith and discipline. But their vision of freedom came with strict rules and often intolerance for anyone who disagreed. By the early 16th century, the religious landscape of England was turbulent. The Church of England, established under Henry VIII and reinforced under Elizabeth I, enforced strict conformity. Puritans seeking to purify the church and separatists desiring to break from it entirely faced imprisonment, fines, and social ostracism. In 1620, a group of separatists, later called Pilgrims, boarded the Mayflower, seeking a new life in the Americas. They landed at Plymouth Rock, a location chosen for its defensible position and access to the sea, though it was already winter, the hardest season for survival. Meanwhile, larger groups of Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay in the 1630s, motivated not by profit but by the desire to build a city upon a hill, a model Christian society. These communities emphasized education, moral discipline, and civic participation, all grounded in a strict interpretation of Scripture. The Pilgrims' first winter was brutal. Out of the 102 passengers, nearly half died from cold, malnutrition, and disease. Shelter was minimal. Food supplies dwindled. Every day was a fight for survival. Yet they endured through community cooperation, adaptation, and alliances. Local indigenous groups, including the Wampanoag, provided critical knowledge about planting corn, fishing, and foraging. The famous alliance between Massasoit and the Pilgrims enabled temporary peace and mutual aid, culminating in the first Thanksgiving, a moment of cautious partnership amid a larger landscape of uncertainty and danger. The Puritans, arriving later, imposed strict discipline within their settlements. Church attendance was mandatory. Dissent was punished. Education was emphasized to ensure that citizens could read the Bible. Laws were written with moral imperatives, intertwining civic and religious authority. Daily life was regimented. Prayers, sermons, work, and study structured existence from dawn to dusk. Paradoxically, the Puritan and Pilgrim quest for freedom did not extend universally. While they sought refuge from persecution, they often denied liberties to those who disagreed with their doctrines. Figures such as Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson challenged the rigid social and religious norms, advocating for separation of church and state, or alternative interpretations of faith. Both were banished from Massachusetts Bay, leading to the founding of colonies like Rhode Island, where religious tolerance was practiced more broadly. This tension between freedom for some and oppression for others defined New England society. Communities were tightly knit and morally disciplined, yet fragile under internal and external pressures. Despite hardships, New England colonies established enduring cultural foundations. Public schools ensured literacy and education tied directly to reading Scripture. Town meetings and civic participation cultivated a sense of communal governance. Social norms, religious observances, and legal structures intertwined to create a unique colonial identity. These foundations would shape not only the spiritual and civic life of New England, but also influence future American political thought, education systems, and communal values. The Puritans' vision was successful in its longevity, though achieved through strict regulation and harsh enforcement of conformity. But peace would not last. As settlements expanded, the demand for land clashed with indigenous territories. Disputes over trade, resources, and sovereignty escalated into conflicts such as the Pequot War and later King Philip's War, foreshadowing centuries of tension between native peoples and European settlers. The Puritan dream of a divinely guided society was secure in its ideals, but fragile in reality. Across the continent, forces of labor, conquest, and cultural collision were converging, setting the stage for a new era of struggle, expansion, and transformation in the Americas.
From colonies to a new nation. America was born from colonization, but also rebellion. The same lands that European settlers claimed, fought over, and exploited would become the foundation for a nation that challenged the very powers that created it. Colonization planted seeds of wealth, culture, and conflict, and centuries later, those seeds would erupt into revolution. By the early 18th century, the 13 colonies stretched along the eastern seaboard, from New England to Georgia. The British Crown exercised control through governors, trade regulations, and military presence. Colonists were subject to laws like the Navigation Acts, which restricted trade to benefit England and were taxed on everyday items including paper, tea, and sugar. The empire demanded loyalty, yet its oversight was inconsistent. Local assemblies, town meetings, and militias gave the colonists practice in self-governance, creating tension between authority and autonomy. The Atlantic trade, plantation economies, and European conflicts had intertwined the colonies in a global system. Colonists were growing economically independent, culturally distinct, and politically experienced, and yet bound to an empire they increasingly viewed as distant, unresponsive, and extractive. The mid-18th century brought a series of fiscal pressures. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, had drained Britain's treasury, and the Crown sought to offset costs by taxing the colonies. The Sugar Act, 1764, Stamp Act, 1765, and later the Townshend Acts, 1767, ignited colonial outrage. Colonists objected not merely to the taxes, but to the principle: no taxation without representation. They had built economies, governed towns, and defended lands, yet were expected to pay for distant wars they did not directly influence. Resistance took many forms: petitions, boycotts, and protests. Organizations like the Sons of Liberty mobilized public opinion, sometimes violently. In Boston, the Tea Act, 1773, led to the iconic Boston Tea Party, a dramatic act of defiance that symbolized the growing rift between colonies and crown. Even as protest grew, everyday life in the colonies continued. Farmers, merchants, and artisans lived within a society shaped by colonial experience, indigenous displacement, enslaved labor, and Puritan-influenced culture. These elements of daily life informed revolutionary thinking, a sense that self-governance was not only possible, but essential. The irony was profound. The British Empire, which had built colonies through conquest, labor exploitation, and strategic alliances, created a society capable of independence. Colonial militias, trained during frontier conflicts and native wars, combined with the political experience of local assemblies, created a population ready to defend its rights and challenge authority. The empire exported governance, commerce, and conflict, and in doing so, empowered its subjects to eventually reject imperial control. By the 1770s, the rift was unbridgeable. Revolutionary ideas spread, inspired by Enlightenment thought, colonial experience, and frustration with imperial overreach. The colonies were no longer extensions of Britain. They were communities shaped by centuries of survival, resistance, and adaptation. The legacy of colonization was complex. Who paid the price? Indigenous nations were dispossessed, decimated by disease, and marginalized. Enslaved Africans were forcibly transported, enduring generations of brutality. Who inherited the power? European settlers and their descendants gained land, wealth, and political influence, laying the foundations of a society structured around property, labor, and hierarchy. Colonization transformed the Americas violently and permanently. It created wealth and opportunity, but also inequality, conflict, and displacement. The new nation emerging in 1776 was built on a foundation both ingenious and tragic, reflecting centuries of conquest, adaptation, and struggle. America was not discovered, it was transformed violently and permanently. Indigenous peoples survived in spite of the losses.
African traditions endured in culture, language, and religion. European settlers forged communities and governments. Modern America is a patchwork of these histories, shaped by conquest, migration, survival, and rebellion. The story didn't end with colonization. We are still living inside its consequences, in our borders, economies, identities, and political systems. And as the sun set on the 18th century, a new chapter was beginning. A nation reborn from the ashes of colonization, yet inseparable from its legacy.